welcome everybody to this really interesting talk that Larry Skogen is going to be giving on his work, his research. This is part of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute's Civic Civility, Having Civil Conversations in Our Communities public forum series. And it is sponsored by Humanities North Dakota, the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at NDSU, and NDSU School of Education. So our speaker is a distinguished person. He is a native of Hettinger, North Dakota. He holds degrees from Dickinson State University, University of Central Missouri, and Arizona State University. Excuse me. Retired from a career in the U.S. Air Force, Dr. Skogen has been involved in education as a high school teacher and as a college faculty member and administrator in a variety of military and civilian institutions, including the United States Air Force Academy and New Mexico Military Institute. In 2007, the North Dakota State Board of Higher Education appointed him as the 6th CEO of Bismarck State College. In 2013, he was selected as the interim chancellor of the North Dakota University System, and then he returned to BSC as president in 2015. He retired from that position and became president emeritus in 2020. He is the author of Indian Depredation Claims, 1796 to 1920, published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 1996. And in 2024, the University of Nebraska Press published his To Educate American Indians, selected writings from the National Education Association's Department of Indian Education, 1900 to 1904. So let us welcome our speaker, and what will happen is he will give his talk for about 45 minutes. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and at the end of this, he'll be taking those. So, Dr. Skogen, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody spending their lunch hour with me, although I'm in New Mexico and we haven't had lunch yet, so it's still morning here. But I really appreciate this opportunity, and to all the organizations on the slide that Dennis mentioned too, I thank them for allowing me this opportunity to talk about this topic. So I'm assuming that everybody can see my slide, and if I advance here, we're going to be on another slide. So my academic interest has always been federal Indian policy for a long time. And one of the things I kept running across when I studied federal Indian policy was this idea that the United States government was responsible for civilizing the Indians. And it always puzzled me what that meant, civilize the Indians. It just seemed to me that the Indians had civilization. If you've ever been to the Four Corners area in Colorado and Mesa Verde, that is as grand as going to the castles in Europe that I've been fortunate enough to travel to. That to me appeared to be a civilization. If you've ever been to Acoma in New Mexico, people have lived here on this mesa for almost 1,000 years. And you can still visit it, and they still do celebrations, particular religious ceremonies there. That to me was a civilization. Back home in North Dakota along the Missouri River, we had the earthen lodges. And even out on the prairie, we certainly the farm I grew up on, we could go out and we could find teepee rings. And to me, this all meant that somehow they had civilization. So exactly what is the federal government doing when they're saying we've got to civilize the Indians? So I pondered that question, and I thought, to get to an answer, I'm going to have to go to documents from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and find out what was meant by civilizing Indians. And the result of that, I ended up with the book that Dennis mentioned, and there's another one coming out this fall on the same topic. But first I'm going to tell you what they meant, and then we'll go into, and I'll talk about the book, To Educate American Indians. So what did it mean to have civilized men and women? When they talked about civilizing the Indians, this is what they were talking about. Number one, they weren't white. Okay, the white race was the skillful, aggressive, and productive race. So civilizing Indians meant that they weren't white, and you had to bring them into civilization. Because if they were white, they would have been civilized, but because they were people of color, they were not civilized. It meant that they had to be a Christian. documents from that time, and this is an exact quote: "Man is naturally religious, and if he is ignorant of the true God, he must make to himself false ones." That meant that only the Christian God was the true God, and anything else was a false God. And so to civilize Indians meant that they had to make them Christians. Also, they had to bring them into capitalism. They had to have a money sense. They had to monetize labor. If they didn't have that money sense, and that's one of the things I find out from the educators, they're always talking about that somehow they need to get students understanding the value of a dollar. That was part of the civilization process. And then there's sort of a lifestyle ways, the clothing. Indians that were not civilized were called blanket Indians because they weren't wearing trousers, shirt, and a coat like a white man. Um, they often talked about civilizing Indians by getting rid of the I'm sorry, the migratory habits. That wasn't really true. All Indians weren't migratory, and when they weren't simply roaming. They knew what they were doing, but nevertheless, they had to fix them someplace. They often talked about the civilization process of a cabin on a few acres of land somewhere, and that was part of the civilization process. And finally, the family relations. Men worked and women kept house. And if the women worked and the men didn't work, or at least from the white perspective, they weren't working, then they were not civilized. Sitting Bull actually had something to say about this. And I'm going to read a quick quotation from Sitting Bull. When they were talking about this civilization process where they wanted to turn the men into farmers and the women into housekeepers. And those of you in North Dakota know that women were the agriculturalists among the tribes of the Great Plains and elsewhere, down here in the Southwest as well. And so here's what Sitting Bull said: "Take pity on my women, for they have no future. The young men can be like the white men, till the soil, supply the food and clothing. They will take the work out of the hands of the women, and the women, to whom we have owed everything in the past, will be stripped of all which gave them power and position among the people. Give a future to my women." And so the civilization process was, in fact, destroying that kind of culture where the women were the agriculturalists and the men were not. And so, anyway, as I read the documents from the late 1800s and the early 1900s, this is what they meant when they said they had to civilize Indians. Well, as I was going through the documents, and I read a ton of documents I read a ton of encyclopedias and journals and newspapers to try to figure out what they meant by civilizing Indians. But what I found out is that and it used to be called the National Educational Association. Today, then the AL on educational was dropped off in 1907. Anyway, the National Education Association actually had a Department of Indian Education. And at this Department of Indian Education, folks got together and sat around and talked about how they were going to civilize the Indians. And so this NEA Department of Education that I was exposed to during this research lasted from 1900 to 1909. But then I asked the question, what was its history? How did it come about? Where were the full papers? Because in the journals, many of them were listed as abstracts. And it was just obvious that they were cut down versions of the original papers. And I thought, where are those original papers? And who were these people? Who were the people that worked at these Indian schools and presented these papers? And I wanted to answer that question. And then what does all this tell us about American Indian education? Federal government carried that out. And what did these papers tell us about that educational process? And so very quickly, there's three major archives that I had to work with. The National Education Association Archives is at George Washington University. I'm going to introduce you to Estelle Reel here in just a minute. But the Estelle Reel collection, there are two of them. One of them is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the other is in Spokane, Washington. and then a plethora of journals and newspapers and stuff like that to be able to tell this story. So the result of that is this book that Dennis talked about, and I will mention that there, and I probably already did, that there are two volumes. This one is 1900 to 1904. The second one is 1905 to 1909, and that's coming out from the University of Nebraska this fall. And I'll tell you why there's that division here in a minute. So the book tells the history of the two books tell the history of the department. I provide 60 full and annotated papers as they were delivered, identify the presenters of those papers, and then I draw some conclusions that I will get to here today. So who is Estelle Real? Well, she was from Illinois. She was a university trained educator. She started teaching in her home state, and then she moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1887. Her brother, his nickname was Heck, it was Hector, but he was the mayor of Cheyenne, Wyoming. In 1887, she went out there. She became political because Wyoming was one of the few states that allowed women to be political. And she ran for superintendent of schools in Laramie County, and that's where Cheyenne is located. And then in 1895, she became Wyoming's superintendent of public instruction. It's often stated that she was the first woman elected to a statewide office. That's not true. North Dakota has that distinction. A woman by the name of Laura Eisenhuth was elected to the Department of Public Education, North Dakota in 1895. That was actually the first woman. But Estelle Real gets credit for being the first in a lot of the literature. Anyway, in 1896, she campaigned for McKinley for president, and she did that in the western states that allowed women to vote. McKinley did not win those states, but he was impressed enough with Estelle Real that he then appointed her superintendent of Indian schools in 1898. Estelle Real is the first woman to receive an executive position by president that was confirmed by the United States Senate. Now, there were other women that were confirmed by the Senate, but they were postmistresses, as they called them then, the postmasters. And that was just a list, and they just perfunctorily approved those lists. Estelle Real actually went through a confirmation process. She's the first woman in American history to do that. She held that position of superintendent of any schools longer than any other. And she worked with the NEA to establish this Department of Indian Education. And she was a member of the NEA, a very active member of the NEA as a result of her work in Wyoming. Now, this becomes really important to historians because at this time, there were two conflicting philosophies about how to civilize Indians. There were the total assimilationists, and then there was the scientific racism. And what's really important from a historian's perspective is to be able to see both of these schools of thought at play in the papers that they presented at these NEA conventions. So the first one, the total assimilationists, and Thomas Jefferson was one of those. Thomas Jefferson at one point said that the only remnant of the Indian at some point will be that their blood runs through our veins as well. So there would be a total assimilation of the Native Americans within the American population. But total assimilationists believe that Indians just had to quit being Indians. If they would quit being Indians, they could be assimilated into the dominant culture, which of course was the white culture. Most famously, Richard Pratt, who founded Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later. He said, kill the Indian in him and save the man. It's pretty brutal. But they had to stop being Indians. If they'll just stop being Indians, they'll become civilized and they can participate in this great culture called the American culture. And they proposed to do this total immersion very quickly. Well, against this philosophy was the other philosophy by the progressive educators. And the progressive educators believed that evolution was a very slow process. They fully accepted Darwinism, but they also accepted that races developed at different rates. And the white race had developed much faster and was well ahead anybody of color. And so it's a gradual process, and it was going to take generations. Whereas the total assimilationists said, well, we just couldn't just stop them from being Indians, they'll be civilized. Whereas the progressives said, oh, no, 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 it's a much harder process. One of them talked about the tedious process of evolution. It was going to take a long time. And what that did is it provided a scientific basis for white superiority. Whites had advanced faster, whites were more advanced, and we'll talk more about that here in just a bit. Okay, so the heir of these two conflicting philosophies is overseen by two commissioners of Indian Affairs. I mentioned there are two books. I originally developed this idea to be one book that was going to be about the Department of Indian Education. Turns out it was pretty long. And so the editor said, well, is there a logical place to break this so that we could come out with two volumes? And there was a logical place because it was two commissioners and each one had a different philosophy. So each book shows the domination of each one of these philosophies. So the first one was Jones. You can see he became commissioner in 1897. Became superintendent in 1898. Um, he saw his role as commissioner was to get rid of the reservations and the tribal organizations. And eventually, Indians will just be part of our culture. Um, People of Jones' ilk would be shocked today to find out we still have reservations. Reservations were never established to be permanent. Reservations were established to be that sort of cauldron where all of this civilization process was going to occur, and then it would just disappear. And Native Americans would just become American citizens within our culture. And so Jones represents the total assimilationist idea. He was replaced by Francis Loop, who became commissioner on January 1905. Loop has a very different view here. He says, you can see that quotation, the mistake made by his well-wishers is the assumption that he's simply a white man with red skin. No, he's not a white man with red skin. He's an Indian, and they're further behind in evolution. And imagine saying this as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The Indian is an adult child. So an adult looks like an adult, but has the mentality of a 14-year-old boy. I mean, terrible stuff. And they talked a lot about, these progressives talked a lot about the child race. The child race was the Indian race because they were like children. And it was the job of the whites and the white Indian school workers to bring them up to the same level as much as they could in white civilization. Now, remember, Richard Pratt was one of the total assimilationists, said, kill the Indian and save the man, right? Well, Loop says, I like the Indians. I like what's in him. Well, we're absorbing them into our civilization. We should not wash out what is distinctively Indian. Now, the problem with that is the white educators and the white bureaucrats like Loop were going to decide what was distinctive that they wanted to preserve. They were the ones going to make that decision. This writer calls this imperialist nostalgia, and it kind of makes racial domination appear innocent and pure. The bottom line is that the progressives were sort of patting the Indians on the head, saying, "Well, we like you. You're Indians. We like you. You're less than us. We will help you acculturate into our society, but we know that you can never be just like us because we're white." So now let's move back into the NEA. So in 1899, Estelle Real worked to establish the NEA. They held their first meeting in Charleston in 1900. It was disbanded in 1909, and the papers delivered were published in the annual journals, and I showed you a picture of one of those early on. So then I always wondered, well, why did Real want to establish a department of NEA? And it was such short-lived, it lasted 10 years. Why did she want to establish one? Well, first, she said Indian school workers were incredibly isolated. Secondly, she thought, and we would call this today professional development. She thought that the Indian school educators needed to have some professional development, and coming to these NEA meetings would give them some professional development. And third, she thought it was really important that that she and the Indian school educators demonstrate what they were doing to assimilate this child race, this native population, into the dominant society. So let's take a look at these individually. Indian schools were incredibly isolated. Well, one of the Indian schools was Hampton in Virginia. Hampton was actually established as a freedmen's school for formerly enslaved African Americans to get educated because it was illegal in southern states to educate blacks during the time of slavery. Um, and in 1877, our man Richard Pratt again, he was in charge of some Indians at a prison down in Florida, and he brought them up to Hampton, Virginia, and he said, you know, we can educate Indians just like they're doing at Hampton with blacks. And so he brought these Indians to Hampton. My point here is that then Hampton had decades of Indian education as well as black education. Um, but if you were working at Hampton, you were not isolated. And then in 1879, Pratt opened Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. This is the largest boarding school the United States will ever have, has the most employees, has the most students. If you're in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, you're not isolated. However, if you're in Moki Indian School in Keams Canyon, Arizona, you're isolated. Folks working in this environment were very isolated. If you worked at Little Eagle Boarding School on the Standing Rock Reservation, um, you were isolated. Or if you worked at one of these one-room schoolhouses in New Mexico, you were incredibly isolated. So Rio was right. She had a lot of employees that worked in the Indian schools that were isolated. And so her idea of bringing them into the NEA was to bring them to Charleston, South Carolina, where they met in this building. This is a far cry from Laguna, New Mexico, for the folks that were the educators that were part of the NEA. And the second year, they met in Detroit and they stayed at this hotel and they had a big Indian exhibit here. I'll talk a little bit about those Indian exhibits. So Estelle Reel was right. Many of her employees were isolated and being part of the NEA, she was bringing them, if you will, back into, quote, civilization, unquote, so that they could be retooled to get back out there. Secondly, is she believed in this professional development that we talk about today. And one wonders, did that work? Well, Booker T. Washington, who was a former slave, was educated at Hampton. They heard him at general sessions 3 times while the Indian school workers were part of the NEA. And in fact, he was the house father to the native students that showed up in 1877. He's the one that helped them get acclimated to being at Hampton. So he knew something about Indian education as well. And then he goes on to be the first leader of the Tuskegee Institute. And then William Torrey Harris, he was the U.S. Commissioner of Education. He addressed the general session 3 times, but more importantly, he actually came to the department meetings. He twice addressed the department. And so Indian school educators got to meet the U.S. Commissioner of Education. So they were, they were getting to rub elbows with prominent educators. And in 1905, this is, by the way, a picture of the General Assembly. These are all educators belonging to the NEA that are meeting in 1905, and there's Theodore Roosevelt. His back is to us, giving an address. Indian school educators without the NEA, being members of the NEA, would have never had the opportunity to hear an address from Theodore Roosevelt as educators. And boy, he really He really lathered them up that day. They were so excited because he said everything that educators wanted to hear about how important their work was. In fact, he told them that next to the ministers, they're the most important people in the United States. And if I were a betting man, I would say that's Estelle Real sitting there. I can almost see her glasses there. I can't prove this by any means, but she was a presidential appointed superintendent that they would put her down front, right in front of the president. Makes perfectly good sense to me. And I don't know why I tell that, but I'm just convinced that's Estelle Real. So anyway, and then Ella Flagg Young. Those of you that are educators know all about John Dewey. She taught with John Dewey at the University of Chicago. She was superintendent of the Chicago School. First woman. She was the first woman president of the NEA. She, in 1908, addressed the general session, and she also came to the department. And she's rubbing elbows with the Indian school educators. Um, G. Stanley Hall, leading progressive educator of the time. Look at that, 32 years he was president of Clark University, and you can see the list of journals that he launched. He addressed the department in 1903 and 1908, and nobody's papers were harder to annotate in these two books than G. Stanley Hall because he used terms and he talked about people globally and he tried to set what the work was of the Indian school educators into a global sense. And he would talk about people living on islands, and he would talk about people in Africa, and he would talk about people in South America. And he would just unbelievably difficult to look all that stuff up so I could put a footnote so people could know what he was talking about. Well, I got to tell you what one of his students said about him. G. Stanley Hall. His lecturing resembled the surging rush of a swollen stream which gathers to itself both rich sediment and worthless trash and carries both vehemently to the sea. And so I had plenty of evidence of that as I went through his papers. But again, Real was right. By being members of the NEA, her NEA school educators got to rub elbows with one of the most important progressive educators of the time, G. Stanley Hall. So then finally was demonstrate what the Indian schools were doing. And so at each one of the NEA meetings, she would set up displays. This is the first one that was in Charleston, 1900. Now, here to me is what's interesting, and I'll point this out as I show you a couple more pictures here. But in 1900, Pratt, we've already talked about Richard Pratt, kill the Indian and save the man. Pratt was president of the department, of this NEA department. He didn't attend the meeting, that was irrelevant. He was the president, he was scheduled to speak, and he didn't show up. But you can look at the pictures that she put here, this display she put together, and this could have been a white school in Iowa someplace, right? There's absolutely nothing to indicate that these students were native, nothing at all. Real, however, is one of those progressive educators. And she started then in 1902, we can see she started to add Indian things to her displays. And then by 1903, look at that. Unbelievable pottery, blankets, rugs. Um, she's not out to kill the Indian. She believes that Indian art is sort of the future for the Indians because they can weave rugs and they can sell them. They can weave blankets and they can sell them. They can make pottery and they can sell it. So a very capitalistic view of what she was talking about. And then you'll notice the pictures up on the wall. So she would have all the schools submit pictures that would be part of this display that she put together. And so this is a close-up of them. These are this summer we were at the National Archives and found a whole book of these pictures. But you can see what they're doing. They're shoeing horses, right? They're wheel riding, they're carpentering, they're doing some leather work. Well, it's because Real believed that it was not necessary to study useless things in order to get the discipline necessary for doing useful things. And to her, useless things were playing the piano. She deprecated schools that would allow the young girls to take piano lessons. That was useless. Um, Teaching ancient history, useless. Teaching about ancient or about mountain ranges, useless. She wanted Indians to be educated only in useful, what she considered useful skills. Okay. No true academic training, useful skills as far as she was concerned. Okay. So I'm going to now present to you some of my takeaways from my research on both books. Okay. You got to keep in mind there's two books here. This is the first one, second one coming out this fall. Okay. Takeaway number one. Um, there's a current initiative that Secretary Holland had to study the effects of the Indian schools to demonstrate generational trauma of survivors and their descendants. And for many people, it's wow, how could people participate in this? Because this had to be terrible. Well, one of my takeaways for you is that they knew about this. They knew this was a negative environment for the Indian boarding schools. They knew it. This was not a newfound idea that this was hurting students, and they said it. Let's take a look at one here. I'm gonna read you a little quote. During the early years of Indian education, buildings were carelessly erected. No thought was given to furnishing proper systems of ventilation, lighting, and heating. As a result, children in many schools broke down in health, sickened, and died. Can you imagine a superintendent saying, yeah, well, kids came to us and they died? So it's not newfound that all of a sudden Indian students were dying at boarding schools. They knew it, that the Indian students were dying at those boarding schools. Um, Here's another one. So A.O. Wright, um, another serious difficulty with the education of Indian children comes from the fact that as a rule, with few exceptions, their education is in boarding schools. No institution can be as good for a child as a family. Babies cannot be brought up in cold storage warehouses, which the best of institutions are inevitably. The old fashion of orphan asylums for children deprived of their parents is now passing away and is condemned by all students of social problems. Instead of organizing day schools for younger children, they have been brought into boarding schools when they are not old enough to learn industries and when they might better than have been better left with their mothers as far as their health and general progress is concerned. Isn't that amazing? They knew these schools were bad. Here's what he's talking about. Haskell Boarding School. These are children at Haskell Boarding School. These are children deprived of their families, their mothers. Here's Carlisle. Look at the little kids in front. These kids were picked up from reservations in the Dakotas as far as Arizona and California, and they were brought to Pennsylvania, and here they were educated in this industrial environment. This is what Wright was talking about in 1902. They knew this was bad. Talking about the prevention of tuberculosis in 1909, this doctor said, have we not been guilty of criminal negligence if we have not prevented spitting around our schools and in them? Have we not been guilty if we have failed to disinfect the rooms, bedding, and clothing of these children? Have we not been guilty of spreading tuberculosis and other conditions two or more children in one bed, personal attention to the health of the individual child is frequently neglected. Same guy I quoted earlier, he did an inspection of a school. He says, an inspection of the boys' dormitory building revealed the fact that there are 46 boys roomed in one room where the capacity is 23. 52 were in another room the same size. 27 were in a room with a capacity of 14. In the girls' building, there were 40 girls in a room with a capacity of 24. So the tragedy, one of my takeaways is the tragedy of the Indian boarding schools is not a newfound phenomena. The Indian school educators knew it was a tragedy as they were doing it. Okay. Secondly, there's a lot of talk about generational trauma of survivors. It is my argument that depriving these students of academic training because of racist assumptions of their natural abilities, we have to understand that as well. The Indian school curriculum has generational implications for Indian school survivors. In other words, people at these Indian schools were not provided an academic education. They were provided some sort of training. And so generationally, if an academic education would have moved them into being a medical doctor or a lawyer, and that would have affected the following generations. Okay. So they were pigeonholed into non-academic areas simply because of the color of their skin. The third takeaway is that the same assimilation strategies that were used in the Indian schools were now going to be used on the non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Protestant immigrants coming into the country. So this time, the public schools are dealing with a huge infusion of immigrants from Italy, from Russia, from Greece, non-Protestant, non-Anglo-Saxon, non-English speaking, and they were being forced into these public schools in these urban areas. And so those public school educators, as a result of the Indian school educators being there with them, those public school educators said, wow, we could do this with Italians. We could do this with those Germans from Russia. We could do this with, and the list goes on. And if you don't buy my saying so, look at what they said in 1908, the Journal of Education. How often was heard the cry, and this is during the NEA meeting, how often was heard the cry, let us educate normal white boys and girls as well as we are educating Indians, Negroes, and the atypical. In other words, what they're doing with the colored people in our country, as they would say, we should be doing to the Italians and the Greeks and the Spaniards and whoever else is flooding into our country. Okay, my last takeaway, and I'll be wrapped up here, and it's about Estelle Real. I learned in this process she's an incredibly complex person. She was a professional woman in a man's world. There's no doubt about that. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs that ended up terminating the Superintendent of Indian School position did it because she was a woman. And in my research, I found a letter from him to the Secretary of Interior in which he said, I'm writing to you man to man. And then he says, I must have men, and he underlined it. I must have men in my office. I must have men as superintendents. I must have men running these programs. He meant it. And so 2 weeks after he became Commissioner of Indian Affairs and he replaced Loop in June of 1909, 2 weeks after that, he started the movement to get rid of her position and to end the Department of Indian Education. Okay. So she was a victim of this misogynistic commissioner of Indian Affairs, but she was also a racist woman that superintended over Indian boarding schools. Okay. Here's what she said about Indians. They can't master mathematics, but they're good as manual laborers. And then in 1910, she's quoting what Loop had said in 1905. They might look like adults, but they really have the mentality of 14-year-olds. She said this 12 years after she had become superintendent of Indian schools. The Indian is not ready for higher education, but native girls make ideal servants. Okay. Now, here's where this gets really complex. She had unbounded support for her African American chief clerk. One of the most surprising things that I found, George Benjamin. George Benjamin was born in Nebraska, raised in Cheyenne. That's how she knew him, because she was in Cheyenne. He was the first African American to graduate from Wyoming Public School. He got a job in the land office. And in just a few months after she became superintendent in Washington, D.C., she moved him over to become his chief clerk. And she told her employees, she said, "You're going to take direction from Chief Clerk Benjamin, whether I'm in the office or not." It's very confusing to understand. Now he went on, he got a law degree, he became a pharmacist. He's an amazing guy. And I got these photographs. I happened to meet his great granddaughter, and she had some photographs of him. Okay, so why is that so confusing? Because this is what white America thought about the racial hierarchy. You know, you got the WAFs, you got the poor whites, you got the old immigrants. Then there's a line of whiteness. You put the Irish under that. Then you got all the new immigrants coming in. And then below that, you got the Native Americans. And then below that, you have the African Americans. So I've never really understood how Estelle Real was such a racist when it came to Native Americans, and yet had unbounded faith in her chief clerk, who was an African American. Okay, so that's about 45 minutes right there. And I said, I promised Dennis that I would wrap up in that amount of time. And then if there were any questions, but I can tell you, I have been so pleased in the response that I've gotten from this first publication, and looking forward to the second one again, and how it highlights. Because if you ever wanted to say, what were they thinking about Indian school educators, their papers tell us what they were thinking. And by the way, the picture behind me is pictures of the educators at their 1904 annual meeting of the Indian school educators. So anyway, that wraps it up, Dennis, unless there's some questions.
Well, I want to thank you for a very well-researched talk and a very interesting one. I had lots of questions while you're talking, so I'm going to start off. If you've got a question, I'm just going to tell the audience, if you've got a question, you can put it in chat, or send it to me. But I want to think about this a little bit more. So I'm glad at the end, you were talking about how selective the isms were. The racism was selective, and how it doesn't make sense. When I was listening to or watching the discussion or the quotations about indigenous folks here, it was always about men. Did you find much about women when they're talking about it?
Okay, to begin with, at that time, they did sort of the non-generic thing. You always use the male as the example. And so oftentimes when they said, we need to teach the student, we need to teach him to do this, they really meant all the students. Now, once in a while, I found educators who actually, almost always women educators, who would put in their paper him or her. which I found um, pretty interesting that they did that. But the prejudice against the women that comes across very, very clearly a lot is that they have to be homemakers and they have to be prepared for homemaking and motherhood.
Mm,
And so that now, in the meantime, and Estelle Real said this often about, well, but they make really great domestic servants. Okay. And so it wasn't a matter of educating young girls to do anything, but well, they had nursing programs, they had education programs, and then they had cooking programs for women. And at these NEA conventions in 1908, 9, and 9, especially, the young Indian women actually cooked lunches for visitors to their exhibits.
mm.
And so they were demonstrating that they were good cooks. I don't know if that answers your question, but often it's confusing because oftentimes they use the male pronouns when they really meant him or her.
Okay. I'm going to drill down, but I want Bennett F has a question here and writes, how much of a role did the church play in industrial schools? And if it did, what denominations?
Okay,
Uh, Writes, I am from Canada, so I have learned a lot about residential schools in Canada, and the Catholic Church played a very large role in them.
right. And so there are roughly, and I'm rounding these off, there's about 1,500 Indian schools. Now, there's boarding schools, there's on-reservation boarding schools, there's off-reservation boarding schools, and then there's day schools. So there's about 1,500. About 500 of those were run by the federal government. About 1,000 of them were run by churches. Now, the Catholic Church in the United States, too, uh, was an important element to that. Um, I, I've so in the United States, we had Presbyterians, we had Episcopalians, we had Methodists, we had Lutherans. Um, all of them played a part. They believed it was part of their missionary work was to establish schools, Christianize, teach English, and so forth to the students. Um, I have said many times about the problem in the United States compared to Canada, and I've not studied Canada, so I apologize if I get this wrong. But in Canada, I think many of the schools were run by the Catholics. Therefore, the Pope could come over and make an apology, and it really hit a good number of the schools. That would not be the case in the United States. The Pope's not going to come here and give an apology because he can't apologize for what the Lutherans did or the Methodists or the Episcopalians. So, but back to the original question, there's about 1,000 schools in the United States that are run by churches, or I should say were, put it in the past tense.
So, and you got to thank for your answer. So I want to go. You raised an interesting question about the racism that that the one person had who was the in charge of the schools, and you said why this black man was okay,
Yeah.
but other folks were not. I was just wondering, um, maybe familiarity was a guess that I made, that if you're from Wyoming, the racism against indigenous folks are just baked in. That's part of the culture that you learn. But there aren't a lot, I'm assuming there weren't a lot of black folks in Wyoming.
Right, right, right.
So maybe that she hadn't built in those racial stereotypes and biases
Yeah,
because there's no interaction or that wasn't part of the culture.
yeah. Well, I appreciate that thought. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer. She defended him. Uh, she got into trouble by this. I should point that out. Um, the Civil Service Commission at the time was very involved in the hiring of people in the Indian office. She was hiring folks, and there was sort of a standard questions you could ask. This is kind of the same way today, right? There's
Yeah.
standard questions you can ask, and she added supplemental questions to that. And one of her supplemental questions was, are you willing to take direction from my chief clerk, and as she put it, who is a colored man? And the civil service actually opened an investigation on her for that unauthorized question. And she was defended by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who said, well, problems have arisen in her department over this issue of her chief clerk directing employees. And there are employees that take exception to that. So that was sort of baked in, if you will, to the Washington, D.C. culture, right? But you raise a good point. Unfortunately, Estelle Real never left me anything to read about why she was so adamant in defending Benjamin and so readily threw Native Americans under the intellectual bus that they were just not smart enough for higher education.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because things that happen now don't happen just randomly. Everything that happens now can be connected back, or at least I should say, most things that happen can be connected back somehow to our past, um, and what occurred there. I was There used to be in high schools, you had a guidance counselor who would put you on a pathway. So my pathway turned out to be college. Other people, they went to vocational schools where it was basically decided for you based on talking to folks and things. Um, so how did they do it there? It was just a blanket. Okay, all males are going to be doing this sort of work.
Hmm.
And which trades and why those trades?
Well, and it was just blanket. Because they were students of color, they were expected to do manual labor. Whether that was domestic for the girls or something mechanical for the boys. That was just an assumption, going in assumption. Now, this is something Richard Pratt argued against. Richard Pratt believed that, well, by golly, at Carlisle, and he did originally at Carlisle, we're going to teach them history and music and literature, and we're going to do all that. And eventually, they're going to get very well educated, and then they're going to move out into our society. And there are some wonderful examples of this. Um, Charles Eastman, who was a medical doctor, was native. And in fact, he was the medical doctor at Wounded Knee when they were bringing the wounded into the church that was decorated for Christmas at the time. Um, and he was native, but he had gone through the process of actually receiving an education. But by the time Real established, and she laid out her curriculum in about 1901, um, and it was all geared towards vocational uh, training. And it was just the fact that they were Indians. That was it. Yeah.
Well, um, so it's hard to really grasp how big of a I'm not going to say it was a tragedy for the people who had to undergo it. It was a form of genocide, if I can use that term, or an attempt at it by the ones in power. So I'm going to hit Vine Deloria's work. I'm This might be unfair because you didn't mention him, but I one of his articles is on the red and the black. And so his discussion is when you're talking about different groups of people, you can't think of their experiences as being the same because of how they were treated. So blacks were to be excluded because they were not human. They, While indigenous folks, and you brought this out, they could be okay because they were white enough, but they would never be fully developed as whites could be. And what happened to the indigenous? They lost their lands. They lost the economic benefit, and the other ones were they were excluded from society. Um, so again, this is probably an unfair question, But if you're looking at Delorias, when they're characterizing indigenous folks, what did you find most of? That they were like children, they're whites, but they were just sort of, I don't want to say they were mentally delayed. They could never be fully white. Was it, some of them said to kill the Indian, but not the man.
Right.
Was it the culture they thought was the problem,
It,
or was it a combination of these?
well, I think it's a combination of all the above, but it certainly was the culture that they had to get rid of. And then with Loop becoming commissioner in 1905, it was, well, let's not wipe out everything. And so Estelle Real was one, and I mentioned this. Well, if they'll make pottery, then that can be sold. If they'll make rugs and blankets, then that can be sold. And so it was how to move them best into the capitalistic society, if you will.
Hmm.
Now, about black versus red, Jim Thorpe is a good example of this. Okay. Um, there was a time when the only thing a black could do at a baseball diamond was to be a groundskeeper. And at that same time, there were guys like Jim Thorpe that were playing baseball. And so there was a divide in viewing where blacks fit in society and where natives fit into society. They were not seen as similar, except that some of the same rules applied in this particular case. For example, at Hampton, they were teaching black students in vocations as well, and that's what Tuskegee did later on. Is when that was founded, is that was teaching in vocations, and that's what the Indian schools were doing to Native students. So in some ways there's similarities. In other ways, uh, obviously there were differences. The big issue, and you alluded to this, is the land base. Okay, that's a huge issue because African Americans didn't have a land base to get stolen from them. And, one of the failures of Reconstruction is that the rich plantation owners kept all their land, and African Americans ended up working on that land and so on. Whereas Native Americans had a land base. Well, then in 1887, with the Dawes Act, they even broke up that land base, and the natives ended up losing two-thirds of their land. But if you were to ask a Indian school educator in 1905 what they expected their student to do, they expected their student to get on an allotment of land because as they broke up the reservations, each Indian was assigned an allotment of land. They expected them to move on to that allotment of land and then look like the Norwegian farmers down the road or the German farmers down the road. That's what they expected with their native students. That's what they would have all said. Um, they generally didn't expect them to move to New York and become mechanics,
Yeah.
although they would expect some of the native young ladies to go to New York and become servants for the Vanderbilts or something like that. That would have been an acceptable thing.
Well, it's almost one, so I'm going to draw this really interesting conversation to a close. I want to thank all of the folks who were here today to be able to hear a really in-depth examination. And when did you say the next volume comes out, the next book comes out?
Right. So this book is 1900 to 1904. 1905 to 1909 is in the fall catalog for the University of Nebraska. So I expect to see a copy by about September.
Well, well, thank you. And I think at least you'll sell a few books from us. So that's a very good thing. I want to thank you, Larry, for giving this presentation. It's great. And I'm hoping other folks see this and then they will also ask you to talk about this incredibly important thing for North Dakota, especially since it still affects a lot of our folks. Just because times have moved on doesn't mean that the injuries of the past are not affecting us even today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And have a, I know you're in New Mexico. Uh, hopefully we'll see you back in North Dakota when we warm up.
You bet. Thanks to
Thanks.
everybody for participating.